Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite aspects of UFO research, and that is humanoid cases. The title of today's episode is I Met an Extraterrestrial, 10 First-Hand Face-to-Face Encounters. There are so many of them, far more I think than most people realize. I've got 10 cases today that are really spectacular, because in these cases, people got a really good look at these humanoids. They were literally face to face with someone that was clearly not from around here. All different types of humanoids. I think you'll find it really fascinating. I've got cases from all over the world, including Austria, France, Italy, Spain, as well as Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and 3 from the United States, including Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Wyoming. These cases range quite a long period of time. The earliest is 1954, and the latest is 2024. I think you'll find them really fascinating, so let's just get started. First case I want to talk about, I call A Trip to Unknown Places. This one took place on December 9, 1954, in Gricignano d'Aversa, Italy. This is a very small town. This case received almost no publicity at the time it occurred, but it eventually got a lot of publicity because it's a very unusual case and one of the earliest apparent onboard cases. This amazing case first appeared in newspapers, but has been reported on by several major Italian researchers such as Roberto Pinati, Paolo Fiorini, and Umberto Tellerico. It is in fact widely considered to be Italy's first case of alien abduction. The primary witness is a peasant farmer by the name of Giovanni Acqualanti. He was 57 years old at the time of his encounter, not 100 years old, as has been mistakenly reported in several versions on this case. Giovanni was well known and respected by his neighbors. It was on the rainy morning of December 9, 1954, that Giovanni left his home in the small town of Gricignano d'Aversa, Italy. He was going to work in the fields as he always did every morning. But when evening arrived, Giovanni did not arrive home. So his family was concerned, and his 2 sons, Andrea and Paolo, set out to search for him. Unable to find him, they alerted the police, but a search failed to find any evidence of Giovanni. So the next morning and throughout the day, Giovanni's family and others continued the search, but again they could not find the missing man. As the evening ended, around midnight, Giovanni's sons Paolo and Andrea and another relative were returning home after searching for Giovanni all day and most of the night. They had just about reached their home when the 3 men were petrified to see 2 very odd-looking figures with phosphorescent eyes hiding behind a low wall in the field next to them. After just a few seconds, Andrea, the younger brother, dashed towards the 2 figures, but by the time he reached the wall where they were hiding, the figures had mysteriously disappeared. So that's unusual. Now, on December 11, the next morning at 6 a.m., exactly 48 hours since Giovanni was last seen, Giovanni returned home. He was shocked and hungry, but not tired, he said. Despite the fact that it had been raining continuously for 2 days, Giovanni's clothes were mysteriously perfectly dry, and so were his shoes. His wife and 2 sons immediately bombarded him with questions, but Giovanni was in such a state of shock that he was unable or unwilling to answer. But it was a few hours later that one of Giovanni's relatives finally got the story from him. Giovanni said that on the morning of the 9th, he had just left the house and was passing by the village's railroad bridge, as you can see here, when 2, he called them dwarves, emerged from behind the bushes. Per Giovanni, they had, quote, faces the color of fire. He said they had very shiny eyes and wore clothes with, quote, colors like the rainbow. They spoke to him in an unintelligible language, then grabbed him by the hands, and he said, lifted him up into the sky. Now from this point, his memories become somewhat confused and disjointed. He said that at times these dwarves would become giant-sized, but would then shrink back down to dwarf size. He said that they made him walk continuously, but that his body was so light that he never got tired. He said that they took him on a trip to, quote, unknown places. At some point, he flew through the sky with them again, and they deposited him right next to his house, somehow communicating to him that they would return one day and come back for him. Now, Giovanni's family says that Giovanni was never the same after this incident. They said he lived in constant fear that, quote, they might come back to get me. He was perpetually confused, he had difficulty speaking, and in fact he stuttered from that time onward. One interesting and significant detail that is left out of most of the accounts on this case is that before the encounter, Giovanni suffered from a painful bone disease that caused him enormous discomfort and pain. But after the encounter, the bone disease had completely disappeared. This case received only modest publicity, but again would later become fairly well known. And in fact, after his encounter, Giovanni earned the nickname Giovanni on the Moon. He lived for about 20 more years before passing away in the early 1970s. Now, this case did take place during the tail end of a massive wave centered mostly in France, but also in surrounding areas and definitely in Italy. In fact, in December of 1954 alone, there were 3 other cases involving humanoids in Italy. For example, on December 4th, a waiter from Castel di Nogara in Italy reported his sighting of a circular object which had landed in a pasture about 150 feet away from him, 50 meters. He said it was blue in color and had symmetrical, glowing red portholes. He said a very tall figure emerged from the craft, at which point he retrieved his rifle and fired 2 shots at the being. Immediately, and not surprising, the being returned to the craft. At that point, there was a strong wind and the craft took off. Another case occurred on the morning of December 11, 1954, the very same morning that Giovanni Acqualanti was returned to his home. This case involved an 11-year-old girl by the name of Nanda Frasinetti. She had left her home in Cassina, Italy, and was walking to school in the morning when she says she saw a cylindrical or kind of cask-shaped object sitting in a field and glowing with intense light. She said it had a window on the side, and through the window she could see a small person staring out at her. The object disappeared pretty quickly, leaving behind a strong odor, and at the site of the UFO landing, 5 holes were found in the ground, with the one in the center being the deepest. Turned out other people in the area also reported seeing apparently the same UFO. And it was just 2.5 weeks later, on the morning of December 30th, 1954, that a gentleman by the name of Pietro Trussardi was at Clusone, Italy, when he says he heard the rumble of a motor and looking up, saw a strange object flying at very low altitude. He said it stopped and hovered about 60 feet up, 20 meters, and he saw that it was brass-colored, spindle-shaped, and had what looked like 3 motionless propellers on the top and the bottom. One end of the object did have a transparent cockpit, inside of which he saw 2 short, olive-skinned humanoids wearing helmets and black jumpsuits. He said he was so shocked and afraid that he almost fell to the ground. But then the 2 little men smiled at him, and the craft took off at high speed. Pietro says, "The beings didn't do anything to harm me." That case is so interesting to me in so many different ways. These ETs, of course, are described in very unusual ways. They're changing sizes. I very rarely hear that, but it is not unique. What's also interesting to me is that there are multiple witnesses. The main witness's son also saw these humanoids, and the guy was missing for 2 days. That is very unusual. It's unfortunate he doesn't remember more about what happened to him, but what's also interesting is this is apparently Italy's first so-called alien abduction. I think that alone makes this case particularly important. But now let's move to the next case, which I'll bet you have never heard of. I certainly haven't, but I found it to be a pretty interesting case. I call this one, 2 Beings Approached Us. This is on July 10, 1965 in Ganserndorf, Austria. This is a multiple witness case involving two witnesses, and I think it's an important case because it really illustrates the electromagnetic effects that can occur when people get very close to a UFO. This case is quite brief, but still very interesting, and it is provided by the first-hand witness, Mr. Herb Bretschneider, who sent in his testimony to a popular UFO magazine. Again, this is a good example of a UFO affecting a vehicle's engine. It was 10:15 p.m. on the moonlit night of July 10, 1965, as Herb and his girlfriend, Miss Hansi Schrogel, were traveling by motorcycle in a forested area near Ganserndorf, Austria, when they had a very close-up encounter with a disc-shaped craft and humanoids. As Herb says, it approached us, floating at a level of 5 meters, that's 15 feet, slightly inclined until it landed 100 meters away from us and 30 meters away from a high-power electric line. I started the motorcycle and approached. Now, per Herb, the craft was glowing with intensely bright white light, but once the witnesses got about 40 meters away, 120 feet, from the craft, the engine on the motorcycle went dead and the headlights went out. They proceeded to back up, and at 50 meters, 150 feet, the engine turned back on, as did the headlight. So apparently there's a force field right around this craft, which affected the engine at precisely 40 meters. The witnesses then decided to approach on foot. As they got closer, the intense light coming from the craft dimmed, which allowed them to see two humanoids looking at them and moving closer. As Herb says, two beings could be seen approaching us, their left side illuminated by the moon, their clothing tightly on their body in a dark color, in a seemingly floating gait. We receded since we hadn't any flashlight with us. When we reached our motorcycle, we turned on the big road light and saw that the figures were approximately 1.8 to 1.9 meters tall. That's just under 6 feet. And as Herb says, they then stopped observing us. After some seconds, they turned and noiselessly returned to their machine, which was nearby, floating above the ground. Slowly, I followed them on the motorcycle. When they reached the machine, we could see, when they inclined forward a bit, disappearing beneath. I turned my motor off, and we could now hear a buzzing sound, like that of an electric motor, with a pitch rising to a higher octave. The disc rose easily to a height of 5 meters, inclined itself, and flew back to the point from which it had come. There it changed its color to a whitish blue, seen well against the dark sky, and then, with a big speed, it vanished in seconds from our view. I think in most respects that's a fairly typical case of a UFO landing, humanoids coming out, briefly greeting the witnesses, and then getting right back into their craft. There's countless cases like this. It's a really interesting type of behavior that to me makes me wonder if this is really more of a display than anything else, sort of introducing people to the idea that we are not alone. It certainly worked for those two witnesses. All right, let's move to the next case. This one is super fascinating. I call this one Little Men of Great Learning. This occurred on September 10, 1965, in a little village called Pau Ferro. This is in Brazil. This is technically a single witness case, so there are some corollary witnesses, some sort of corroborating witnesses who didn't see the humanoids but definitely had reason to believe that something unusual was going on. This case is so interesting, I think, because it shows how ETs are concerned and trying not to scare people, while at the same time definitely trying to make contact. This amazing case of a UFO landing with humanoids comes from Dr. Walter Buehler and was published in the Brazilian publication Sociedade Brasileira de Estudos sobre Discos Voadores. In other words, the Brazilian Society for the Study of Flying Saucers. This is in issue number 54. The witness is a farmer and caterer by the name of Antonio Pau Ferro da Silva. It was on the morning of September 10, 1965, that Antonio was out in the fields of his farm, which is located at a little village called Pau Ferro in Pernambuco, Brazil. It was 8:30 a.m. and he was about 300 meters from his house, 900 feet, waiting for his wife to bring him a cup of hot coffee. So when he heard the rustling in the corn behind him, he turned around expecting to see his wife, but instead he saw two metallic discs, shiny like aluminum, making a high-pitched hissing sound and causing a gust of wind. These saucers began to lower themselves simultaneously to the ground about 8 meters away, 24 feet, at a lower elevation since he was standing on a hill. The sound coming from the craft became lower pitched. Antonio was absolutely terrified by the sight of these two craft. He wondered if he was having a vision, if God was punishing him, if an atomic bomb was being dropped and he was going to die, or it was the end of the world or something. So he was quite frightened. He steadied himself with his garden hoe in one hand and grabbed a cashew tree in the other. Now no sooner had the saucers reached the ground when they immediately rose back up again, hovering about 5 meters or 15 feet high, and Antonio could now see the bottom surface of these saucers was slightly concave. He estimates that they were about 1.5 meters wide and 60 centimeters thick. That's not very big, about 4.5 feet by 2 feet. He said as they rose up, what he described as, quote, root-like appendages seemed to retract into the craft. Now immediately below where each craft had landed were two short humanoids just under 1 meter tall. He estimates about 2.5 feet. Still frozen with fear and shock, these two little men approached him, but apparently seeing that he was in a state of extreme fear, they turned around and walked back beneath these two saucers, which were still hovering in place. Now reaching that point, they looked over their shoulders, glancing at Antonio in a very friendly way, and they then turned around and began to walk towards him again, but this time with a much slower and gentler pace. And in fact, they stopped and were admiring the wild tomato plants growing between the rows of corn. One of the little men picked up a tomato, showed it to the other little man, and spoke in some sort of foreign language, and then dropped it on the ground. Antonio could not understand the language, but he said it reminded him a little bit of Japanese. These two little men then walked right up to Antonio, and he asked them what they wanted. The men did not answer, but just smiled at him. But Antonio could now see that these two little men looked entirely human. They had very smooth, flawless, tanned skin with no wrinkles. He said it did look a little strange, almost waxy, but he said they were very friendly, or as he says in his own words, they were well built, with good ears, and the impression was they were fine people. Those little men were of great learning. Nevertheless, they didn't make fun of me. He said that they were clearly adults, not children, although their size was very much similar to his 4-year-old daughter. Again, 1 meter or 3 feet high, coming up to about his knees. He was too shocked and awestruck to really pay attention to their clothing. The only thing he could say was that it was one piece and tight-fitting. Now at this point, the men turned around again and approached their respective craft. Antonio thought to himself, are those the much spoken of flying saucer men? And at that moment, the men turned around again and approached him for a third time. Very briefly, they then returned to their craft, which lowered down, scooped them up somehow, though Antonio couldn't say how, because the steepness of the terrain blocked his view. And these craft flew away, again making a sound that rose and pitched and caused a gust of wind. After the craft left, Antonio was astonished. He grabbed the tomato that one of the beings had dropped. He picked it up and ran over to the home of his neighbor, Olegario Guilherme da Rocha. Olegario immediately saw that his neighbor and friend was shaken and pale. Antonio actually handed him the tomato. He was in such a state of shock he couldn't stand. He sat down on the ground and explained what had just happened. Now, both of these men were later interviewed by UFO researchers, including Walter Buehler. During this time, 2 other witnesses actually came forth, a woman named Eunice and a girl named Ivanilda. They were both in the area at the time and said that at the exact same time that Antonio had his encounter, they both heard a, quote, strange noise, but they were unable to see where it was coming from. This case was published in several magazines, and Walter Buehler says that when he interviewed Antonio, he was still trembling with fear. How interesting is that? There's several different aspects to that case that I found particularly fascinating. Mostly how these ETs approached very slowly at first, went back, and then approached again, clearly concerned about how the witness was reacting to them. I also found it interesting how he described these ETs as being very much human-looking, only 2-3 feet tall, so quite small. Just an absolutely fascinating case. And now let's move to another one, which did get a lot of attention at the time. It's very well confirmed. It's a multiple witness case. There are landing traces as well. I think you'll find this one fascinating. I call it the Sing Song Aliens. This occurred on July 17, 1967, in a beautiful, picturesque little village in France called Arc-sous-Sican. It's an amazing case. This case comes from French researcher Joël Ménard and was published in several magazines such as Phénomènes Spatiaux and Lumière dans la Nuit and Flying Saucer Review and several others. And at the time it occurred, it was also published in local newspapers and featured on radio. So it got quite a bit of attention. There are several witnesses to a number of strange events involving very unusual humanoids. It was about 3 p.m. on July 17, 1967, as a group of young children left the small, picturesque village of Arc-sous-Sican, not far from the border of Switzerland, to go for a walk through the fields just north of this town. This town is tiny. It has about 700 inhabitants. One of the children was 5-year-old Patricia Bipois. She was about 20 meters or 60 feet ahead of the other children, when to her shock and fear, she came upon a group of 3 or 4 very short humanoids, which she described as little Chinamen dressed in black. She said that they were hiding behind a bramble bush, and upon seeing her, one of these little men stood up and, per Patricia, attempted to grab her. Needless to say, she was terrified, and she immediately turned around, screaming at her companions that she saw something strange, and ran straight back home as fast as she could to tell her parents. Now, the next person to notice something strange was one of the boys in this group, a 10-year-old boy by the name of Monsieur Ravier, who noticed what he first thought was smoke, but later described something more like a glowing vertical beam of yellow light going upwards. Meanwhile, his sister, Joëlle Ravier, age 15, was back in town when Patricia came running and screaming, so Joëlle and her friend Marie-Reine Moirot went running off to where the other children were. This was about 300 to 400 meters away from the houses, less than 1/5 of a mile. The other young children stood back while Joëlle went to where Patricia had seen the little man. Arriving at the spot, she saw a strange little creature running from bush to bush at extremely high speed, moving its legs much faster than any human. She described this creature as 1 meter tall, 3 feet, black or wearing black clothes, and per Joëlle, this being wore a short jacket or a vest, which seemed to float behind him as he ran. This little man had a protuberant belly, very short legs. She couldn't tell if it had arms or not, nor was she able to make out its face. Now when it disappeared behind a bush, Joëlle, this time accompanied by her friend Marie-Reine, approached the bush, and they could both hear a voice talking in a strange sing-song fashion, and this scared them both enough to cause them to retreat and join the other children. Now later, adults inspected the area. They did not see the humanoids, but they did find a dozen very peculiar dry yellowed marks in the otherwise green grass field. These stained areas were warm to the touch and also gave off an odd odor. None of the adults had ever seen anything like it, they said, and they could not attribute it to the cows which roamed the area, so it was a mystery. 5-year-old Patricia was really too young to describe her encounter in much detail, but 15-year-old Joelle was held in high regard by those who knew her, and providing some possible confirmation of her encounter. That evening, 2 astronomers at the observatory in Besançon, a short distance north of the village, saw a, quote, luminous round object, which after remaining stationary for 30 seconds over the horizon, made off towards the south and vanished at high speed. This was followed by a flurry of reports of glowing objects by people all across Europe, both from the night of the 17th and the 18th. And in fact, on July 19th, a 12-year-old boy from the village says he saw a bright glow in the forest just outside of town, which lasted for a long time. So that's pretty good confirmation. And there was more. On May 22nd, 1967, less than 2 months earlier, in the small town of Évillé, France, about 16 kilometers away from Arc-sous-Sican, Monsieur Thiraud, a 45-year-old teacher, says he was driving outside of town when he saw a craft shaped like a, quote, upturned soup plate. He said it glowed with a yellow-green light. Here's a drawing of it. It was clearly a solid craft, about 20 meters wide by 2.5 meters tall. This is 60 feet by 8 feet. This craft proceeded to move over his head no more than 20 meters, 60 feet high. It moved in silence, but as it passed overhead, Mr. Thiraud could hear a, quote, crackling sound. 2 months later, around the same time as the Arc-sous-Sican encounter, most of the residents of the village of Évillé observed a strange machine hover for a full 3 hours over the village. And these are just a few of the many, many cases that occurred around that time in this area. How interesting is that case? I mean, you have all these kids who are witnesses, and while only a few of them saw the actual humanoids, there were landing traces. And the wave of sightings that night and the next few days, I think, really lends a level of corroboration to the initial sighting. Also super fascinating is the description of the humanoids that these children saw, which is definitely not one I've heard often, if ever. But it's a fascinating case on many levels. And so is this next one, which I call something unusual and extraordinary. This is another multiple witness case which occurred on September 25, 1967 in Sant Feliu de Codines, Spain. This encounter occurred while the 2 witnesses were driving. But what's fascinating to me about this case is how closely the ET, or the humanoid, resembles the case I just spoke about in France. This one is an unusual one. This case first appeared in the March 1971 issue of the Spanish UFO magazine Stendek, but was later published in a number of other magazines. It involves 2 witnesses, Mauricio Wiesenthal and his fiancée, Maria Rosa Font. It was on the evening of September 25, 1967. The engaged couple had spent the day with Mauricio's family, but when evening arrived, they began the drive to their home in Barcelona, Spain. It was around 9:30 p.m., a warm, clear night, as they traveled along Regional Road 1413 between the small villages of Sant Quirze Safaja and Sant Feliu de Codines. Curiously, this area had recently experienced a series of unexplained fires, which were being blamed on a, quote, mad arsonist. The couple was just a few kilometers outside of the village when suddenly the headlights of their car illuminated a small glowing green humanoid figure emerging from the shadows on the right-hand side of the road. It at first appeared to be walking in a ditch alongside the road. Mauricio estimated it was about 120 meters ahead of them, 360 feet. But surprised by the sight, at first he didn't say anything. But a few seconds later, Maria Rosa shouted out in fear, "Look!" They were approaching this figure very quickly, and as they got close, they could see that this was definitely humanoid, walking like a person. And suddenly, it walked right in front of their car, straight across the road. And as their car was almost upon it, it began to walk faster at a diagonal. And at this point, they could see that this was a humanoid creature. It was right in front of their car. They both felt a mixture of fear and disgust at its very unusual appearance. In fact, they were so close to this being as they drove past it that they were afraid they might have actually struck it with their vehicle. They said it was about 70 centimeters tall. It's about 2 feet 3 inches. It had an egg-shaped head, no visible neck. They really only saw it in profile. They did not notice any eyes, nose, or mouth, but they did notice that its arms were abnormally long and that it either had very large hands or had something in its hands. It was swinging its arms as it crossed the road, but never turned its head. It had very large feet, short, thick legs, and it also had a very fat stomach and very large buttocks. They weren't sure if the creature was naked or if it was wearing a skin-tight suit like those worn by scuba divers, but whether it was skin or clothing, they did see that it was phosphorescent neon green and very satiny, shiny. It was in view, they said, for, quote, 8 very long seconds. This filled them with fear, so they did not stop but raced away at high speed, and upon arriving home, they shared their experience with family and friends, who were somewhat skeptical and suggested that perhaps they had seen a very large badger, something, of course, which both Mauricio and Maria Rosa vehemently disagreed with. Both insist that they did not see an animal, but saw something out of the ordinary, something unusual and extraordinary, something inexplicable, and definitely humanoid. Interestingly, only 2 months earlier, in some distance to the south, one evening in July of 1967, a lady, the daughter of the Count of Reeves, was asleep in her home in the Balearic Islands. This is located about 5 kilometers from Palma de Mallorca. When around 3 a.m., she was awakened by a powerful light coming into her bedroom from the interior courtyard. Looking out the window, she says she saw 2 child-sized figures who appeared to be talking to each other. There shouldn't be anyone in there at that time, so this frightened her. Also, they had an enormous head, perhaps with a helmet on, and very large eyes, so definitely not normal figures. Frightened, she tried to wake up her sister-in-law, with whom she shared a room, but curiously, her sister-in-law would not wake up. She then tried to turn on the light, and it wouldn't work. So she went to fetch some candles, but by the time she returned, these little beings were gone. And of course, now the room light worked fine. The next morning, they did find 2 strange, unusual marks near the window, which had to be scraped off to be removed. The ultimate result of this encounter was that the young woman remained bedridden for 3 days, and from that point forward, she refused to sleep alone. That case does raise a lot of questions. It's funny to me that the witness's family decided to explain this encounter away as badgers, perhaps, when obviously this wasn't badgers. It's interesting that there were all these unexplained fires going on in this area at that time. Not sure there's any connection there, but it's enough to make you wonder. Also, the other humanoid cases in this area, rarely are these events a one-off. There's no direct UFO connection with that couple who was driving down this road and saw this green-skinned humanoid, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was a craft there that other people didn't report, because as we know, most people do not report these sort of events. And you may be skeptical of it, but there's always another one to take its place, like this next case, which I call, I Think They Tried to Take Me. This one occurred on March 17, 1986, in Santa Ana, Argentina. And this case, if there's any in this compilation that you've heard of, it's probably this one, because it did get considerable publicity. It's a really fascinating case, technically a single witness case, although again there are some outside witnesses, some really well-confirmed landing traces. And this one is just a fascinating case. Physiological effects, a really interesting interaction with the witness and these ETs, really unusual ETs as well. Within a few days after this next incident occurred, it began to appear in newspapers and magazines, and it got a lot of attention. The witness is a farmer by the name of Rito Melgarejo. On the evening of March 17, 1986, he had visited a group of friends to play cards at one of their homes in Santa Ana de los Guacaras. This is in Corrientes, Argentina. They played late into the evening. Rito lived some distance away in a place called El Mangal due to the many mango trees in the area. It had rained heavily that day. The ground was wet with many large puddles. It was prone to flooding. It was around 1 or 2 a.m. Rito was walking home, and he had almost arrived, when suddenly he was confronted by something amazing. Now, he had never gone to school or read anything about UFOs, but when he saw a light moving towards him from behind a small hill, he thought at first it was a plane, but then it quickly approached and became much brighter, and he realized he was seeing something quite unusual. As Rito says, "I saw a very powerful light illuminating me completely, so much that I could clearly see my shadow on the ground. It was a very bright object which practically fell on top of me and stopped on the ground about 10 meters away. I didn't know what the thing was. I was really scared. My head started hurting and I couldn't move because my legs were cramping." So he estimates that this craft was about 6 meters wide and 4 meters high. That's 18 feet by 12 feet. It had landed very quickly in a large puddle in the field he was crossing, and as Rito says, when the object descended into the water, it made a noise like someone splashing, like ducks paddling. Now, before Rito could react, a door opened in the craft and 2 humanoids stepped out. He estimated that they were about 1 meter tall, just over 3 feet. And Rito describes what happened next. As he says, "I saw 2 little creatures, 2 big-headed dwarfs, about the height of a 6 or 7-year-old, quickly exit the device. They looked like small Martians. They were like us humans, only tiny. They undoubtedly looked human. They had black hair, cut like military personnel. They were wearing some kind of dark uniform, tight-fitting. One of them spoke in a language I couldn't understand. It was not Spanish. They made a noise like a broken radio. He spoke very fast. He made hand signals that looked like something in a circle, but I told him I didn't understand. Right then and there, I felt my waist to see if my knife was in place. It was going to be difficult for them to take me. All I could manage to say was that I didn't know anything. They were making signs to me as if they wanted me to come closer. I froze, and at that moment I felt a kind of cramp and tingling all over my body. I wanted to run, but I could not even move. One of them signaled with his hand as if calling me. I told them I didn't understand anything, nor did I want to understand anything. I couldn't see them well because of the bright light, because I was dazzled. I was terrified. Then I thought they wanted to take me, and that's when I got scared. I was astonished and afraid. I didn't look at it much because I was afraid that they would take me and then never bring me back again. These beings spoke among themselves, turned around and got into the device. I turned around and tried to get home fast. Now, Rito again had the impression that the UFO occupants were gesturing to him to, quote, "get on board and go for a ride." So he turned and ran, and when he looked back, he saw that this craft was now up in the sky already and quickly receding off into the distance. And as Rito says, "After that, I was lost in the field for a few hours, because I became disoriented and didn't know how to return. I tried to return home, but I was bewildered and disoriented. I walked in the countryside until 4 a.m. when I was able to reach my house, which wasn't very far away, about 1,000 meters from where I was." Now, arriving home, his wife, Maria Magdalena, was shocked at her husband's appearance. She was skeptical at first, but after she saw him, she realized something had happened to him, because as she says, he was almost crying and very nervous. He was terribly scared. Following the encounter, Rito suffered from a very bad, persistent headache. As he says, "I've had a severe headache that hasn't gone down. Nothing will relieve it, and if it continues like this, I'll have to go to the doctor." This was 3 or 4 days after the incident, and his wife confirms this and says, "The cramps have gone away, but not the headache, which is still intense." Now later, upon returning to the site where this craft had landed, Rito and other researchers saw that all the water was gone, and there was a 6 by 4 meter oval mark of burned, yellowed grass. This is about 18 feet by 12 feet. And within the circle were the remains of a deceased eel, which looked almost as if it had been desiccated by the heat from this craft. Even days after the event, this eel showed no signs of decomposition or odor. There were also 3 marks on the ground which appeared to be made by the landing legs of this craft. They were 6 centimeters in diameter, 2.3 inches, and 10 centimeters deep, 3.9 inches. Outside of the landing traces, the grass was healthy and green. So you can see the landing traces here. Many photographs were taken. It's very well verified. Eventually, Rito's headache did go away. However, 1 month after his encounter, he did lose sight in one eye, though investigators could not definitively link this to his experience, nor by his own admission could Rito. As he says, "I don't know if it has anything to do with what happened to me." The only real lasting impact was emotional. As Rito says, in town today, this is almost 30 years later, they still know me by the nickname UFO, but it doesn't bother me. I know very well what happened to me. Honestly, it was something very strange, and to this day, I remember it as if it were yesterday. At first, many didn't believe me, but later when they saw the prints, and many people came from all over to investigate, they agreed with me. The first person to see the footprints, the landing traces, and believe everything I said was my neighbor Don Felipe Sosa, who has since passed away. He also saw light that moved around at night in those days. Now Rito admits that he now spends a lot more time looking up at the sky, afraid and wondering if these beings might one day come back for him. And when he thinks back to the incident, he says, "I think they tried to take me." I really like that case. The witness is so obviously sincere. He was so close to these ETs, there's no possible chance of misperception. I also thought it was interesting, he describes them as being very much human looking, but just tiny little men who came out of this craft and apparently tried to take him, but he wasn't having it. Just an amazing case, as I think all of these cases are. Like this next one, which I call, "Do You Believe in Aliens?" This one occurred one evening in the fall of 2008 in Breezewood, Pennsylvania. This is a single witness case, but it's so fascinating because there's an event which occurs during this encounter that I have never heard before, nor do I think I've ever heard a description quite like this witness says of this type of ET. So there's a lot to unpack with this particular case. This case was reported to MUFON by an anonymous witness. I'll call her Valerie, that's a pseudonym. She provided her first-hand testimony of her very unusual encounter. It was around 4 a.m. one evening in the fall of 2008 when she woke up in her home in Breezewood, Pennsylvania to go to the bathroom. As soon as she got out of bed, this is when she saw a strange humanoid in the room with her. And as Valerie says, "When I reached the foot of the bed, I made eye contact with a short black entity, and immediately was in its hold, emotionally, mentally, and physically. I knew instantly when I saw it that it was an alien creature, but not a typical gray like you read about or see in the movies. The creature was about 4 feet high and was totally black, and stood like a human shape, but its face looked similar to a praying mantis, and some of its skin looked like reptilian. It had dreadlock-like thick and long hair. It also looked like it had a black reflective chest plate. I am not sure if that was part of its natural body or some kind of armor. The creature had huge black pools for eyes, and it spoke to me through telepathy. So at this point, Valerie was unable to move. She could only stand in place. Valerie at the time was wearing a necklace that she loved and cherished, as it was a gift from her daughter who had purchased it for her when she had visited the pyramids of the sun and moon in Mexico. This was a silver necklace holding a round pendant, and this pendant had an image of a warrior on one side and a pyramid on the other side. It was composed of multicolored materials encased in resin. This is important because what the creature did next was both surprising and shocking to Valerie. As Valerie says, "The creature held out its arm and hand towards my neck, and the necklace I was wearing floated out towards its hand. It was still clasped around my neck. It told me through telepathy that it wanted the necklace. I answered back through telepathy that I did not want to let it take the necklace. And she explained why to this entity that it was a gift. And as Valerie says, the creature told me that it just wanted to borrow the necklace and promised to bring it back. I continued to protest through telepathy, but the necklace floated off my neck and into the creature's hand. It did not even have to undo the clasp. It just floated off with ease and no pain to me. During my encounter, I felt like the being had a great deal of control over my emotions and thought. I still felt a shock and horror and despair as it took my necklace, but my heart never raced at all. I remember seeing a side view of the creature, and I saw it from the other side of the bed. The thing looked very scary and menacing, but it was not mean to me other than to upset me by taking my necklace. I do not remember anything else. I woke up and remembered what happened and reached for my necklace, but it was gone. I scoured my room for the necklace for weeks, but did not find it on the hardwood floor or anywhere in the room. And in fact, Valerie enlisted the help of her daughter to search for the necklace over and over. But despite searching for it everywhere over a period of weeks, including both sweeping and vacuuming the hardwood floor, the necklace was nowhere to be found. It was a few months later, Valerie's boyfriend was sleeping over, and she decided to tell him what happened. She started by asking him, "Do you believe in aliens?" And he replied, "Yes." So she shared her story of this alien encounter and the missing necklace, and he replied, "Maybe you cannot find it because you are looking for it with your eyes." That baffled her, and she said, "What is that supposed to mean?" He told her, "Just get up and reenact what happened that night." And as Valerie says, "So, in the dark room, I walked to the foot of the bed where I had met the creature and reached down, and there was the necklace on the floor. I was totally blown away. Apparently, as the creature had promised, it had returned the necklace." Valerie is not sure if anything else happened on the night of her encounter, but admits it's possible, as she has had a lot of, quote, strange things and, quote, a lot of high weirdness happen to her for as long as she can remember. As Valerie says, "But this is the only time I can consciously remember actually seeing an unknown entity. I would like to have hypnotherapy sessions to see if more details and information can be dug up from my consciousness." Now, this area does have a history of UFO encounters. It was just 1 year earlier at 11:30 p.m. on May 27, 2007. A witness was sitting outside his Breezewood home. It was a cloudy night when he noticed a light shining through the clouds, eventually revealing itself to be a disc-shaped craft, as you can see here. As the witness says, the light grew brighter and brighter until it became almost as bright as the moon. As it dimmed out, it began to move slowly to the northwest. 20 minutes later, at 11:50 p.m., another green light appeared heading north. This object slowly pulsated, dim, then bright, with a bluish glow as it brightened. Now, the investigator to this case writes, "The most interesting aspect of this sighting is the picture that the witness drew depicting what he saw. The witness's drawing and verbal description certainly indicate that he saw an unconventional craft." Definitely a unique case. But it's interesting to me because there are other cases where ETs have taken a personal possession of a witness and then later returned it. I mean, that happened to Betty Hill. She had one of her rings taken and later found it on her table. There's a number of cases like that. I know the exact same thing happened to another witness I interviewed personally. She had a ring taken and then it was later returned. So I'm not sure what's going on with this, but certainly a fascinating aspect to that particular case, as well as the unusual description of this ET, which she couldn't decide whether this was reptilian or perhaps praying mantis or a combination of both. A fascinating and unusual case. And this case is also very interesting, this next one, which I call You Will Know in Time. This occurred on August 24, 2013 in Edmond, Oklahoma. This apparently is a multiple witness case. Other researchers have looked into it. It's a little bit controversial, but I think there are aspects to it that really ring true. You can make up your own mind about it, but this is an apparent encounter with missing time involving human-looking extraterrestrials. This case has not been formally investigated, but it has caught the attention of several researchers. It comes from an anonymous college student, I'll call him Sean, who provided his first-hand written testimony of his experience only 3 days after it occurred. At the time of his encounter, Sean was a member of his college fraternity, and they had just finished having a back-to-school get-together with other students along the shore of Arcadia Lake, which you can see here. Some of the students had been partying, but Sean had been selected for the responsibility of ensuring that nobody drove home while intoxicated, and he also had to make sure that the campsite was cleaned up and in good shape following the party. So as he says, as a result of my duties that night, I was completely sober and had not been drinking or using any drugs. So he was finishing picking up all the trash and was putting it in his truck, and this is when he had an odd impulse which marked the beginning of his very unusual encounter. It was now 1 a.m. on August 24, 2013, when, as Sean says, I had this strange urge to look at the lake. The best way to describe that feeling was as if I had been daydreaming. There was nothing unusual going on. Then all of a sudden, there was a bright glowing light under the water. At this particular distance, I couldn't tell exactly how large the circle was, but it was big. The shape was circular and had a light green, yellowish glow with occasional pulsating red and blue lights. I stared at it dumbfounded as it was moving slowly under the water from one side of the lake to the opposite side. The object moved from one side and back to the other 2 or 3 times for about 5 minutes. Then it stopped almost near the center of the lake. The object glowed brighter and brighter, then shot straight out of the water and into the sky. So shocked and frightened by this unusual sight, Sean immediately reacted. As he says, I turned around and ran as fast as I could to my truck. Once I got to my truck, I stopped and fumbled around in my pockets for a couple of seconds, looking for my keys, and seemingly out of nowhere, a bright light appeared suddenly above and behind me. I turned around to see what was behind me, and there was this giant ship. It wasn't saucer-shaped, like everyone talks about, but it had more of a cake shape. It hadn't landed, but just hovered about 20 to 30 feet off the ground for a couple of seconds, then shot back up into the sky. Now it was at this point that things went from very strange to truly bizarre, because as Sean says, I turned back to my truck door and tried to unlock it when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I jumped back against the side of my truck. About 15 feet away stood 3 people staring at me that had not been there prior to the incident. There were 2 very attractive women and 1 very tall man that was at least 10 feet high. All of them had blonde hair that was almost white and blue eyes. They did not say anything to me directly, but I heard one of the woman's voice in my head. Speaking telepathically, this woman said, Sean, please do not be afraid. You have an important role to play if you would like to help us. So Sean replied out loud in a shaky voice, Okay, but I don't know how. The woman replied, Don't worry, you will know in time. Now what happened next is a very common feature in close encounter cases like this. As Sean says, right after she said that, everything went black. Eventually I woke up around 2:30, lying about 30 feet away from my last remembered position at the side of the truck. So Sean was now missing about 1.5 hours of time. He decided to report his encounter to both MUFON and NUFORC, writing, I know you're probably thinking that I am crazy, but it did happen. Now incredibly, there does appear to be another witness to this case who reported it to NUFORC 1 day after Sean. I'll call this other witness Jamie. It was the same night, August 24, at the same time, 1 a.m., but Jamie was apparently on the opposite side of the lake. As the witness says, I was at Lake Arcadia around 12:31 in the morning fishing for catfish out of this old Juan boat. There was absolutely no one else on the water. The only other people that I saw out there that evening was a group of 12 to 15 people around a fire on a campsite on the opposite side of the lake. Believe me, you could tell and hear that they were there. However, there was no one at that site for a while before the sighting. I was getting ready to leave when about 60 to 75 yards behind me, a giant bright and glowing light appeared under the lake's surface. It was fairly large and had a light green color to it with a rhythmic flashing of red and blue lights. Then the light began moving from the western side of the lake's shore to the eastern side and back to the other side a couple of times. Then it stopped almost near the center of the lake. At that moment, it grew brighter and slightly larger, then shot straight up in the air and into the sky and seemingly disappeared for a couple of seconds, and reappeared hovering right over the campsite that I mentioned earlier, and disappeared again. Then it reappeared again maybe a minute later and shot up into the sky and went out of sight, and I never saw it again. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting, as Jamie decided to go investigate. As he says, "I drove my boat over to the site where the craft was hovering as fast as I could get there. However, I did not recognize anything out of the ordinary. Just a white Ford truck with several bags of trash in the bed and a couple others sitting beside it. I did not see anyone by the truck or in the immediate area." So it appears that Jamie arrived right after Sean blacked out and was experiencing missing time, presumably being taken on board this craft. Now, efforts by various researchers to locate these witnesses or confirm these encounters have yielded no results. I do find that case quite credible. There are certain details that the witness describes that I think really ring true to me. How he described this feeling of almost like he was having a daydream. I've heard that sort of thing. People go into a slightly altered state of consciousness sometimes when they're having an encounter. And the message he got from these apparent extraterrestrials, it's just an amazing case. It is interesting to me that it was reported almost immediately to both Newfork and MUFON, and that the other witness did the same thing. I wonder about that, but again, you can make up your own mind about it, and it's a fascinating case on multiple levels. And again, there's always another one, like this next case, which I call "I Never Once Felt Afraid." I've never heard a case quite like this one. This one, at least for the first part, does have multiple witnesses. But in many respects, this case follows the pattern I see in quite a few cases, starting with a sighting, leading to a much closer encounter, and a really interesting aftermath. This one occurred one evening in the summer of 2020 in Laramie, Wyoming. This next very unusual case begins with a sighting. It was late one summer evening in 2020 that Kurt, that's a pseudonym, and his roommate decided to take a walk. They lived in the northern section of Laramie, Wyoming, and were heading south towards downtown, and that's when Kurt looked up and saw something strange. As he says, "I looked into the sky and saw a large black object shaped like a jelly bean, concave side down. It was dark, but I could clearly see the edge of the object because it was reflecting the lights from the city and the sky. It traveled slowly and silently eastward. After a few seconds of observing the object, my roommate, unprompted, pointed into the sky at the object and said, 'Do you see that?' I responded, 'You're seeing that too?' We now both watched the object float silently through the sky for a few minutes until it disappeared behind a cloud. Now that seemed to be the end of the encounter, but it proved to be only the beginning, because it was later that summer that Kurt was alone in his apartment. It was around 10:30 p.m., and feeling tired, he retired to his bedroom and lay down in bed. He was going to put on his pajamas and go to sleep, but before he could, something very strange happened. As Kurt says, "I decided to sit up and get off the bed, but found that my limbs were very heavy. I could not lift my body up off the bed. So I slumped back down onto the bed and immediately noticed a small blackish dot in the middle of the ceiling above me. As soon as I noticed the small black dot, it began to expand until it was a shadowy circle about 3 feet across. It was transparent but dark, and and I could still see the ceiling through the circle. I realized that I was now fully paralyzed, but I never panicked, which I find strange. I remained calm. When the circle stopped expanding, I stared at it and suddenly noticed 3 humanoid tall gray figures, waist up, approaching me through the circle. I could not see their facial features because the circle acted like a tinted window. Next, the central and taller figure extended a beam of green light from the center of its forehead into the center of my forehead. I remember being excited to have the experience at that point and never once felt afraid. As soon as the green beam of light disappeared, the dark circle shrank and also disappeared. So Kurt was stunned. Ever since he was a little kid, he had always been interested in aliens. He had never seen a UFO or had any strange encounters, but he had always wanted to have an encounter, but never believed it would ever happen to him. Immediately after this experience, he had a pretty interesting reaction to it. As Kurt says, "I stayed up all night after that encounter, filled with physical and mental energy. I furiously wrote down every single thought that came to my mind for the next 5 to 6 hours, hoping to uncover some kind of psychological artifact that the entities may have left in my mind. I pored over my notes that night for weeks afterward and never found anything of importance. All that I wrote was several drawings of indecipherable symbols and long rambling paragraphs about quantum physics, aliens, technology, and the future of humanity." So unsure what to make of this experience, he later speculated that perhaps it had all been just a bizarre waking hallucination. But 4 years later, in 2024, this experience still had not left his mind, and he began to wonder if it might all be real. His friend had recently told him about his own encounter while camping in Colorado, and this reignited Kurt's interest in his own encounter and in the subject of UFOs. So Kurt shared his own encounter with a coworker who took his story seriously and encouraged Kurt to report it officially, which he did. I think that's a really amazing case because I do see this pattern of where people will have a close-up sighting and maybe the next night or sometime shortly later, this is when they have a face-to-face encounter with an apparent extraterrestrial. That's exactly what happened to this gentleman. Also really interesting to me is that he had some sort of telepathic connection or information download, and after his encounter stayed up all night writing down all these equations and symbols and messages from the ETs, which clearly had him quite baffled. But that is a pattern we see so much. These encounters affect people profoundly, and often they do get information from the ETs that for some people is very hard to make sense of. Now let's move to the last and final case in this compilation, which I call the strangest experience I ever had. This one occurred on November 24, 2024 in Monterrey, Nuevo León in Mexico. This is a fascinating case, not only because it's so recent, but it looks to me like this would be an indication of humanoids living among us. It's very hard to say because this gentleman did not see a UFO or flying saucer or anything like this. But as you'll see, this was definitely not a normal person that he met. This final case was reported anonymously to MUFON by a first-hand witness about 3 months after it occurred. I'll give the witness the pseudonym Oscar. It was November 24, 2024, and Oscar was staying with friends at a rented Airbnb in the Los Nogales area of Monterrey, Nuevo León in Mexico. As the evening grew late, Oscar decided to step outside and sit by the fire pit just to get away from the noise. And this is when his strange experience began. As Oscar says, "As I was sitting by the fire, I saw someone walking at the edge of the property. They were coming in my direction, so I just thought it was one of my friends walking back to the house. As they got closer, I realized that they were not one of my friends. So I asked them what they wanted, and they said nothing to me. At first, when he looked at me, I noticed his eyes were a little bigger than normal, and I thought maybe they were on drugs that made their pupils huge. But when he talked to me, it was like I heard him, but I didn't see his lips move at all. He asked for water to drink. It was at this point that Oscar got a good look at this figure and realized that he probably wasn't human. Certainly not a normal human. Because as Oscar says, as they got closer, I noticed they didn't have ears. They had ear canals but no ears. It looked as if they were cut off. I didn't want to leave the person, so I called my friend Luis and asked him to bring water outside, and to hurry. He came outside and noticed the person was standing about 10 yards from me. Now the second his friend Luis saw this person, he was visibly surprised and actually cursed out loud. Oscar noticed that the stranger seemed hesitant to come any closer. Perhaps Oscar was speculating because of the fire pit. So Oscar took the water bottle from his friend Luis and walked out towards the man. And as Oscar says, when I got closer, I realized its eyes were not just big from drugs, and I actually got scared. Instantly, as I got scared, the sound of its voice in my head said, "Do not worry, it is okay." When it reached out for the water, I noticed its fingers were rather long. It grabbed the water and walked off. So Oscar saw that in addition to the strange eyes and ears and fingers, this stranger also had a, quote, slightly different skin texture and color. Now his friend afterwards, his friend Luis, told him that it was the devil from the mountains. Oscar's not so sure, as he says, "I have no explanation for what it could have been. I met a strange being. I have never thought about reporting it because I just figured maybe it was a deformed person. But then I could not explain to myself how I heard it talk, but it was like in my head. Then I have doubt myself that maybe its lips really moved and it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then that still doesn't explain the eyes and the ears. To this day, it is the strangest experience I have ever had in my life." Definitely a very unusual experience, and not unique. I did a whole episode called Extraterrestrials Walking Among Us. I think there are some of these people on this planet who are walking among us. People are seeing extraterrestrials and humanoids in very public places. So I think this is an aspect of ufology that does deserve a closer look, because it's not just a few cases. There are a lot of them. And that, I think, is a good example of it. So there you go. 10 cases from all over the world, all different types of humanoids. We've got grays, we've got short little humanoids, we've got very tall whites, I think. All types of, perhaps praying mantis or reptilian. It just goes to show there's a huge variety of humanoids out there, which is certainly what we see on our own planet. So to me, that's no real surprise. And as many contactees have gotten the message, we are you, you are us, we are one, which basically the message is that we all share a common ancestry. Almost all reports of extraterrestrials are humanoid in form. I think this has tremendous implications and goes to show that probably our relationship with the ETs is much closer than we know. So there you go. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting, perhaps learned a few things. Always fascinating to see how many cases there are. I look forward to the day when this subject is fully accepted by all humanity, because I do believe these cases are true. And what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. So thank you again, and until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.